everyone. We'll get started in just a moment as we allow our panelists or our participants to join. I'm watching the participant numbers tick up, and when it slows to a small trickle, we'll get started. It's great to see so many people joining us. We'll get started in just a few moments. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and those that join in the next few moments will enter our lively discussion this morning or the afternoon, depending on where you are. So welcome everyone to today's timely and important discussion on recent trends in international arms transfers. I'm Rachel Stoll, Vice President of the Stimson Center and Director of the Conventional Defense Program. I really couldn't be more pleased today to be joined by a group of renowned experts to help us unpack some of the latest developments in the world of international arms transfer over the course of what has been an especially tumultuous year and seems to only be becoming more tumultuous as the days go on. First, let me introduce my longtime colleague, Peter Wesemann. Peter is a senior researcher with SIPRI's Arms and Military Expenditure Program. He'll be discussing SIPRI's latest report on trends in international arms transfers, and I know we have a lot to learn from these exclusive insights from the latest data that's compiled by Peter and his team that was just launched globally on Monday. So you're hearing it here first, folks. This is the analysis of that data. For those who are unfamiliar, SIPRI is amongst the foremost authorities on international arms transfers and military expenditures. And among their greatest contributions to our field is really their publicly available database that tracks years of military spending and arms transfers. And I'm really proud to say this is the 7th consecutive year, pandemic included, that we've been able to host this event with SIPRI and share their latest annual report on international arms transfers, which I think every year helps us shed light on the shifting dynamics of the global arms trade. I'm also very pleased to be joined by Missy Ryan. Missy is a celebrated journalist with the Washington Post, where she covers issues of diplomacy, national security, and international affairs. And in addition to her rich and broad areas of expertise, Missy has done some really incredible work on global arms transfers, including to the global growing effort to provide military assistance to Ukraine. So she'll be able to put sort of a real-time context to our remarks today. And we're having a few technical difficulties, but I am thrilled that Lauren Woods, who's the director of the Security Assistance Monitor, or SAM, at the Center for International Policy, will be able to join us in a little while as well. Much like SIPRI, SAM is a really invaluable resource to those of us who track the global arms trade. And SAM houses the largest publicly available database on US arms sales, security sector assistance, and foreign military training, which really, again, provides some incredible insight and detail into the US's role as the world's largest global arms transfer. So when she joins us, we will hear from her as well. With that in mind, and before I turn over to the panelists for their remarks, I think it's important to begin our discussion by acknowledging the ongoing tragedy and crisis in Ukraine. As Russian forces pursue their offensive in the country, we are witnessing the very worst consequences of weapons misuse, including a growing body of evidence of indiscriminate and even targeted attacks against Ukrainian civilians and civilian objects. And I think the crisis in Ukraine has really precipitated an extraordinary torrent of new arms transfers to Ukraine, with millions of dollars worth of small arms, light weapons, anti-tank and anti-aerial systems pouring into the country in just the last few weeks alone. And I think the scale and pace of the global effort to shore up Ukraine's defenses may well be unprecedented. I think, I should also say that support for Kiev's right to self-defense is a very worthy imperative. It really does remain to be seen what the long-term risks and consequences of such a vast influx of military hardware will hold for the country's long-term stability, security, and civilian protection environment, and how that will translate to neighboring countries as well. I think it's safe to say that history is regrettably replete with examples of military transfers initiated with all the right intentions that have outlived their contemporary political context and really fed cycles of instability, insecurity, and harm. And while much of the world is focused, understandably, on the military transfers flowing to the government in Kiev, the reality is that across the globe, arms transfers continue to make their way into areas of active armed conflict, often with dire consequences for civilians and for efforts to achieve peace. And this is not just limited to countries we see in the news every day, but from Ethiopia to Syria to Mexico beyond, the flow of arms continues to persist despite mounting evidence of their misuse or their contribution to cycles of violence. And a growing body of research indicates that military transfers endure the eruption of armed conflict, often increasing the duration and intensity of violence. Addressing all of these challenges is made all the more difficult by the fact that international arms transfers and even discussion of international arms transfers often exists largely outside the public eye and in an opaque world that obscures many of the trends, consequences, and complexities associated with the global arms trade. Fortunately, we have discussions like this. We have organizations like CIPRI and SAM that are dedicated to shedding light on this important issue and to promoting transparency and enabling data-driven and informed analyses of how arms transfers are shaping international peace and security. And so I'm really pleased that we, given all of the world events happening today, we're able to have this very important discussion. As I turn it over to Peter to start with his remarks, I want to remind our audience that they may use the Q&A function in the bottom of your Zoom screen to put in questions for our panelists, and we will get to them after all of the panelists have spoken. We are recording this webinar, and so this will be available for you to review. You don't have to take notes furiously. You'll have that data available to you to go back and watch and share with your colleagues. And so I really invite you to listen and think about the kinds of questions you might have for our esteemed panelists as we get started hearing from Peter and the latest CIPRI data. Peter, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. Here from Stockholm, very sunny Stockholm, as you can see. I'm going to present to you some of the latest trends and patterns in international arms transfers over the past 5 years, the past 10 years, and even beyond. And it's just an attempt to give you a sketch of how this looks, a starting point for further discussion with examples from different regions. But of course, after I've given this presentation, you are free to also ask questions about areas, regions, countries, which I haven't necessarily mentioned. So keep that in mind. The work that we do at CIPRI really covers the whole world, and I can only touch upon a little bit here. The work that we do at CIPRI when it comes to measuring international arms transfers, I always have to mention that when I do a presentation like this, is not based on financial values. We don't take the financial reporting for arms exports that some states have and combine that, because that information is not complete. It doesn't tell us really what international arms flows are. It doesn't give us the full picture of trends and patterns we would need to say something useful about the international arms trade or international arms transfers. Instead, we use the CIPRI trend indicator value to show these kind of broad trends, both globally within regions, within sub-regions, and also between the different supplier and recipient kind of groupings that you have. So what you see on the picture here now behind me is an overview of the trend in arms transfers since basically the end of the Cold War. What you very clearly can see in the top line, the kind of the line you see is for annual fluctuations in the overall arms transfers, and then you have the bars, which we prefer to look at as they are less kind of volatile and give a better idea of what the overall trends and the long-term trends are. You can see this clear decrease after the Cold War, ending up in the lowest level around 2006, 2012, and then an increase again. An increase which now, over the past 5 years, seems to have basically leveled out. There is a small decrease, but that doesn't really mean that much. Right now, we seem to be on a plateau. However, of course, when we look at this information, this doesn't tell us anything about the regional variations, and they are very significant. So if we then look at that, and I hope you can see this picture, it might be a bit unclear. I don't know if you can see the whole screen, but basically the biggest bar is for Asia and Oceania, followed by the next is for the Middle East, the second largest arms recipient region in the world, followed by Europe, Africa, and then the Americas. Now, if we look at this, there are several kind of stories or important developments that we can see, but I will start with one which I think is important because it's actually the most, well, positive development that I can see on the global scale, and that is the development in the Americas. In the Americas, we see a very clear decrease in arms imports. Partly that's because the US imports less, and that's maybe not so interesting as the US is not dependent on imports, but it's also because we have seen a very significant decrease in arms imports by Latin American states. They are now at the lowest level of arms imports since basically the last 50 years. And that is a positive story in itself. But if we then look at another region, Europe, which of course is very much in the news, very much in our interest right now, we see a different development. We see a very significant increase. So we can see that if you compare the two bars, we can see that in Europe, we have identified an increase in arms imports of almost 20%. An increase which, of course, comes very much after the 2014 first invasion and annexation of Crimea by Russia. Western countries react to that, strengthen their plans to acquire arms, add new arms to it. And we see that, for example, the UK, Norway, the Netherlands have seen a very significant increase in arms deliveries already. And that is what we count here. By the way, we count arms transfers in terms of actual deliveries of major arms. Other countries in the region don't really show very clearly yet, even those countries in Central Europe, where you would maybe expect that arms imports play an important role. Partly that is because some of those states are very small. They have seen a very big increase in the Baltic states, but they're too small to show on this particular picture. They just in global terms, their arms imports are not that much. But if we take, for example, a country like Poland, it hasn't seen such a large increase in deliveries of major arms in recent years yet, but it has over the past 5 years ordered very significant numbers of new combat aircraft, air-launched cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, air defense and missile defense systems, etc., mainly from the United States. So here we see a very clear development of militarization fed by arms imports. Back to this one again, then the next region we can have a look at is, of course, Asia and Oceania, the largest arms importing region in the world, not necessarily very surprising considering that it is also the largest region in the world. We see a slight decrease there, but it's really not that much. And within that region, there's also an enormous amount of variation. So here we see a little glimpse of how it looks there in terms of who the major suppliers are and who the major importers are. We see that Australia has really increased its arms imports. We also see that Japan and South Korea have done so, and that in all these cases, it has been the US which is the main supplier of arms. And obviously, their increased arms imports are very closely related to their and the US growing threat perception towards China. That feeds the armament dynamics and therefore the arms trade in that region. However, we see, for example, also that yes, India remains the largest arms importer in the region, and for that matter in the world. But there we have seen a very significant decrease over the past few years, which especially has had an impact on the total global value, and for that matter also a very important impact on Russian arms exports. However, it appears that based on the plans and the existing orders, the new orders for weapons that are already in place, that this is just a temporary situation. India wants to import more arms. It also wants to make more arms itself, but it constantly ends up not being able to do so and having to turn to its major suppliers, which by now include Russia, as before, but also very much the US, France, and Israel. And then finally, I can say a few words when it comes to imports about what happens in the Middle East. There we also see a slight increase, only that the overall level is relatively stable. And in the region, it's not surprising then to see that the most important recipient there remains Saudi Arabia, primarily dependent on arms being supplied by the US and by a few other states too. Saudi Arabia is right now the second largest arms importer in the world for the past 5 years. We also see a, whether you could say, remarkable, maybe worrying trend in Egypt, which has invested very heavily in acquiring new equipment from a variety of states. Russia, France, the US, other European states have all seen their exports to Egypt increase significantly. It remains also the question, for example, why Egypt does this, to which perceived threat does this relate? Is it related to the Mediterranean? Is it related to internal threats? Is it related to something else? And also, who pays for this hardware? Can it be Egypt itself, or is there a significant stream of military funding coming from Saudi Arabia and the UAE? One thing which always has to be mentioned in this regard is the fact that Iran stands out as still being a country for which we have not identified any really significant arms imports, or even plans, even actual orders, I should say, for new arms imports. We might have missed a few things, but it doesn't seem that Iran has been, and also not is going to be, a major importer of advanced arms, and as such stands out very much amongst most of the other major countries in the region which do invest significantly in major arms, and where we also see that, for example, a country like Qatar has started to do that over the past 10 years, and now also in the coming years we will see that Kuwait is going to join that club. If we then have finally a quick look at who then are the major suppliers in the world. And so here, and I'm going to disappear a bit out of the screen, but here we see kind of the top 10 largest arms exporting countries. And the clearest thing is, of course, that the US is by far the largest arms supplier of the world. And it has increased in that role too. Over the past 5 years, we identified that the increase is about 14% compared to the previous 5 years. That is very different for Russia. Russia has declined as an arms exporter over the past 5 years. We see a very significant decrease, which something in the region of about 26%. Still the second largest by far, but it is a major difference there, probably, or as far as we can see, mainly related to the fact that its market, its access, its role as a supplier on the Indian arms market has significantly shrunk. And then there are the other suppliers. France stands out now because it has seen a very significant increase over the past 5 years. It moved up to the 3rd place and now stands for over 10% of global arms exports after it clinched a few really major contracts, in particular in Egypt, Qatar, and India. We see that other players have seen some decreases in their arms export, and I think it's important to mention China there, which after a period of seeing its arms export grow very substantially, it now has seen a decrease, and that is maybe somewhat surprising in the light of earlier kind of expectations that China would kind of take a bigger part of the global arms market, but it seems to have hit a kind of a limit there. And then, of course, there are some other states which are mentioned there. I only mention South Korea there because it sticks so much out, as it has really increased its arms imports that much over the past decade, and can really be called a new emerging major country, a major supplier of arms in the world. Now, I'll leave it with these trends and patterns just for you to think about this, and you can come with any kind of questions related to this, because there's way too much to say for me just based on those few minutes I have and should have for this short presentation.
Thank you, Peter. It's always impressive to me how you're able to consolidate a year's worth of data, which is really covering 5 years, into sort of a 10-year or 10-minute presentation, and really give us a glimpse into what the trends are, how those differ in the last 5 years from the previous 5 years. It's really, I think, those of us who look at the arms trade recognize those peaks and valleys that usually accompany sort of major financial crises or global conflicts, and to sort of see this stabilization at such a high level is really, I think, interesting phenomenon. Lauren Woods, as I mentioned, has joined us, and as I mentioned in her intro, she's really been looking at some trends in U.S. arms transfer specifically. As Peter just mentioned, the U.S. continues to be an unrivaled leading exporter of weapons. And so she'll be able to speak to changes in U.S. foreign military sales over the past several years and give us some insights into the trends we're seeing from the U.S. perspective. So Lauren, over to you.
Sure, great. Thank you, Rachel. So yes, I'm Lauren Woods with the Security Assistance Monitor. That's a program at the Center for International Policy. And our data speaks to CIPRI's data, but we measure things a little bit differently. One, as Rachel noted, we focus on the US side. So we are looking at exports coming from the United States. And also our analysis is year by year, as opposed to kind of chunks of years. So last year at this time, we were sitting around kind of like this and looking at 2020, the last year of the Trump administration. And this year we're looking at 2021 and how things have changed since then. So the way we measure this data is we look at US government documents, so Defense Department, State Department, GAO, and a host of other things, and look at where the United States has been focusing its exports in terms of arms sales. And just to set a little bit of the context, when we were talking about this last year, we were reporting on a really, really significant increase in arms sales from the United States in 2020. So measuring foreign military sales, it had reached almost 111 billion, and that was pretty significant. And we were, asking ourselves, what is 2021 going to look like? What is the first year of the Biden administration going to look like? This also, for context, was a time when the U.S. administration had taken a particularly different sort of political posture with regard to arms sales. So prioritizing industry concerns. Some of you may remember that the Trump administration was really speaking about, for example, arms sales to Saudi Arabia as a jobs generator, which is a departure from kind of a more traditional view of arms sales as being, calculated based on a, strategic interest or a national security interest for the United States. So that's where we were at about this time last year. And we will have a report forthcoming soon on our annual arms sales trends report. But just to give a little bit of a preview, I'll pull up a slide and show how 2021 compared to previous years. So I will go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, and you should be able to see in a moment this graph of U.S. foreign military sales between 2017 and 2021. And what you will see here, first of all, as a quick data point before we dive in, I'll note that we are measuring U.S. foreign military sales, that government to government sales, which is, the most complete data we have available. We're not including here for this particular measure direct commercial sales. which would be directly from a U.S. industry to a foreign buyer licensed by the State Department. So, the long and short of it is this is a clear measure of data, but there's also more out there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So you'll notice these first 3 years, 2017 through 2019, we're averaging in the kind of low 60 billions. Then we have that big jump in 2020 that we saw last year. And finally, we get down to the data for the first year of the Biden administration, 2021, which is a significant drop, as you can see, and that is around 36 billion here. So, that is noteworthy. And even considering that 2020 was a big increase, you can see that that is a significant drop in global foreign military sales. So what else can we say about this data with a quick initial look? We can look at who are the major buyers. And, this really varies from year to year. In 2020, the top three were the UAE, Japan, and Finland. And here we have, Greece, Australia, Israel. As you look down the list, you will see a pretty wide geographic spread of countries. That is pretty normal. And, in terms of why, who's at the top, there are different answers every year. The answer is that it depends. Sometimes it's a strategic decision. Sometimes the United States will say, we want to export to this country for a pretty clear reason. Sometimes it may depend on what weapon systems or aircraft or, whatever equipment we're looking at are up for renewal or who needs a new fleet. So sometimes there are just simply, maintenance concerns. There are a variety of reasons. But we can look at some of these top buyers and think about, what's happening here. The number for Greece comes from a number of different deals that were announced, that were notified. One is $2.5 billion for frigate modernization. Some of it is for multi-mission surface combatant ships. There's a variety of reasons. Some of the reasons the U.S. government gave were Greece's strategic importance, on the south of NATO, counterterrorism, counterpiracy. Australia is another country that was very much in the news last year with regard to arms sales, particularly with the new platform with the US, UK, and Australia. But this one also comes from a lot of different deals. There was a lot of discussion in the media about the United States putting a lot of importance on the Asia Pacific, and that certainly seems to be reflected here as well. We also have Israel here, a traditional US partner for both security assistance and arms sales. So you'll see, Israel toward the top of many of those lists. And just a reminder, we're looking at arms sales here. So if we were looking at security assistance or US taxpayer dollars, sending weapons to other countries, you would see a very different profile of countries. You would see, Afghanistan and others from previous years. So this is just a little snapshot of who is buying U.S. arms in 2021. Now, if we go to the breakdown of the regions, you will see not a wholesale shift, but a little bit of a regional shift starting to come out here between 2020 and 2021. Most notably in 2020, you'll see that Middle East and North Africa was much larger in the last year of the Trump administration. That has shrunk in the first year of the Biden administration. And you will see it's kind of lightly written, but you will see Europe and Eurasia is that yellow that has grown a little bit. And that is also in keeping with, this administration's particular focus on returning and looking toward, that group of countries and focusing there. Biden's first visit was to a G7 summit in the UK. And so that was, where a lot of the focus was going, particularly in the beginning of the year. So we are seeing some shifts there. And I'll also mention, it's worth noting, flipping back here, that Saudi Arabia is also still on the list. Some of you may recall that in early 2021, President Biden announced that he was halting U.S. support for offensive operations for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. But nevertheless, Saudi Arabia does, appear fairly high on that list. There were a few deals for Saudi Arabia announced in 2021, and that is still a part of, the profile of U.S. arms exports. And that's in keeping with what we're seeing in terms of this administration so far is, not a huge about face in any direction, but some incremental shifts that we are seeing from the previous year. So that brings me to the final slide to talk about and what we're following. And here's a list of a few recommendations. I would love to say that we had drafted a new list because they'd been accomplished last year, but alas, I had to recycle the recommendations we had from our report for last year. I hope to write new ones in the future. So what would we like to see? What would make, arms sales more transparent, more accountable? Number one, we want more and better data. There are a few things that make data difficult to come by, although, we do our best to analyze everything that's publicly available, and we do cite all of that. A lot of sales still under the Arms Export Control Act are not reported because they fall under a threshold value. One of the ones you'll hear is 14 million. For defense articles, direct commercial sales data is not as complete as we would like it to be, or even as it used to be. There's a lot of item level data that we're not getting, and so we would love to see more of that. We would love to get more information on firearms. We think these are incredibly important to track, particularly given that they're much more portable than other kinds of weapons. And we would love to see more information on deliveries, right? So Congress has the ability to weigh in on a weapon sale up to the point of delivery. And often a lot of time passes between the time that something is notified that it's going to be sold, the contracts go through, it's developed, and then sent. We think it's really important to know what's being delivered and when, again, because this is all part of accountability for a democratic government. A few other things that we also look at in terms of important recommendations are reviews of pending sales, a new conventional arms transfer policy, something that Stimson Center has done great work on, among others. Risk assessments, when you decide to notify or move forward with a sale, are you contemplating, the human rights implications, the impact on civilians, the possibility of corruption, weapons getting lost, a whole host of issues. We could come up with 1,000 examples together of things that have gone wrong and ways that have gone wrong. 2021 Afghanistan is a huge example that I think everyone saw a lot of images in the news of weapons getting into Taliban hands. So I think we can all agree that risk assessments are really, really important. And then finally, strengthening end use monitoring. The end use monitoring regimes in place in the United States really focus on, accounting for the physical location of weapons. And while that's a start, it doesn't do all that it needs to, or even close. We think that end use monitoring should also take into account the impact on civilians, the impact on people, whether they're being used to harm civilians, and a host of other things, which is really why we're interested in where these weapons go. Ultimately, it's how they impact the people who live there and people around the world. So I think that is a good stopping point. And thank you. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Lauren. It is fascinating when you look at the trends over the last 4 years of the Trump administration and then just the first year of the Biden administration to see the differences in both recipients and sheer numbers or volume of arms transfers. I mean, obviously, if you're a country that in 2020 had purchased, $1 billion plus worth of weapons, you're not going to buy $1 billion worth of weapons the following year, but it still is indicative of different approaches and sort of priorities of the U.S. government. I'm really excited to hear from Missy Ryan, who gets a little bit out of the numbers per se and really sees what's happening on the ground and gets to talk to countries and government officials in major exporting states, major importing states, and really has a better understanding on the ground of what is happening with regards to the arms trade, how they're being used, what conflicts are looking like because of the influx of weapons. And so I'm going to turn it over to Missy to provide some comments on sort of the context, to put this all into context for us. So thank you, Missy.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Rachel, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and with Peter and Lauren. And I really appreciate the work you all do to shed light on this issue, which I think is so important and often not the most accessible. So you guys really do break it down in a way that's very valuable. So I am a reporter with the Washington Post. I currently cover the State Department and previously covered the Pentagon. So I've been in this sort of security space. And as you all, as the audience knows, there is a lot of interagency collaboration on the topic of arms sales. So it's a topic that I think is really important. And I'm going to just try to keep my remarks brief and focus primarily on what I'm seeing in terms of the Biden administration and its approach to arms sales and the sort of political and policy context around that. And I will touch on some of the consumer countries as well, because there's, I think, some really interesting back and forth that's happening. And, building on what Lauren mentioned a few minutes ago, I do think that, one of the things that was very notable for me in the last year, probably now 13 or 14 months, was the shift in tone that we saw regarding arms sales from the end of the Trump administration to the beginning of the Biden administration. And, this is something that I had anticipated. We heard President Biden and his team talk about this topic, not so much, but occasionally during the campaign. We also know a lot of these individuals from the Obama administration, some of his key leaders, Jake Sullivan, John Feider, Tony Blinken, all of these people you can point to different histories that they have with the U.S. Export of arms. And, we were speculating a lot about how the positions that the Biden administration would take might be similar or might be different than the Obama administration. And it's been really interesting to see that play out since January of 2021. So one of the things I wanted to mention up front is just sort of the baseline of the Trump administration, as Lauren mentioned, it did have, in what my view was, a more transactional approach to this topic. As Lauren mentioned, they talked about creating jobs in arms sales. If you look at the 2018 policy that Trump signed off on, it mentions obviously national security, but also economic security as a central tenet of what drives American arms sales. Human rights was in there, and you can have a debate about how significant this policy, the 2018 policy on arms sales, was, and how different components of it were interpreted by the Trump administration. But I think stepping back, if you look at the rhetoric that was used and some of the deals that were signed off on or were just touted by the administration, and I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia in particular, it did seem like the human rights aspect was de-emphasized. And then, so, you have that, and Biden comes in January of 2021. In February of just like 2 weeks after he took office, he gives this big address at the State Department on human rights. He promises to put American values, including protection of civilians and human rights, at the core of his foreign policy decision-making. And that's the speech where he, as I think Peter or Lauren mentioned, he said that the United States would no longer provide support for offensive operations in Saudi Arabia. And the reason why I think that the Saudi case and the Saudi operations in Yemen are significant, not just because Saudi Arabia is such a major customer for U.S. arms, I do think it has become sort of a bellwether for how different officials, different agencies, different countries think about how arms are used. And so for the Biden administration, how that pledge was going to be translated into, was going to be enacted and implemented over time, was something I think a lot of us were looking to say, okay, well, how is this, we're hearing this rhetoric. What is this going to look like when we see the rubber hitting the road in terms of transactions that are approved or not approved, and the enforcement, the conversation around all of that. So I think the record on Saudi Arabia and generally on arms sales has been mixed in terms of the reality meeting what many people thought the rhetoric might mean. As many of you may know, there were several PGM sales that were suspended for Saudi Arabia, but there were some air-to-air missiles that were approved, and that drew some criticism. I think that you could have a conversation about what the significance of those weapons were. The perspective from administration officials that I talked to was that those were not something that had relevance for the civilian casualty concerns that have been driving the conversation on Yemen, that they, the Houthis do not have an air force, but they do have rockets and missiles that they fire into Saudi Arabia and now into the UAE. So that was something that, I interpreted as the Biden administration trying to strike a balance and a middle ground in terms of preserving the relationship with the defense relationship with Saudi Arabia and showing support for the defense of an important Gulf ally, while also backing away from what it saw were, it was this egregious, egregious element of that. And I think it was similar in some ways to what we saw with how the Biden administration approached the issue of Jamal Khashoggi's murder. And if you recall, and this is not an arms sale issue, but I do think it's illustrative of this approach in a different way. They put sanctions and travel bans on certain individuals related to that were believed to be involved in the 2018 killing of this journalist, but they stopped short of doing so with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And that, again, I think you were seeing the Biden administration trying to split the difference. And that is something I think we've seen again and again with the arms sales. On a related note, I think, you've seen what they've done in Egypt. They've continued strong arms sales to Egypt. At the same time, they've withheld some security assistance, not enough for the people who would like to see more withheld. And they've come under criticism from some advocacy groups, but more than the Egyptian government clearly is happy with. And so, either they're not being strong enough or, they're striking the right balance because they're being criticized by both sides. And I think these things, again, are open for debate. One of the things that I'm watching is what happens with the sale of F-35s to the UAE. If everybody recalls, this was a deal that was inked right at the end in the final days of the Trump administration. It's then since then undergone all sorts of fits and starts in terms of whether or not the Emirati government will accept some of the conditions and debates about who imposed those conditions. My understanding is that the conditions were set from the beginning by the Trump administration. At least that's what I'm told. And Rachel may have some thoughts about that. That's what I'm told by the Biden administration here. But in any event, that is something that may or may not happen and is something to watch. There is another thing that I think is interesting as an indicator of the Biden administration having a sort of, there's been more continuity than difference, I think, when we step back and look at the overall approach to arms sales. Another issue to watch on this is the sale of armed drones. And the Trump administration approved a loosening of rules related to that, and the Biden administration has left those in place. Basically, what's driving this from my observation and from my conversations with the people in the Biden administration is that, there is, I think, a real desire to elevate human rights and ensure that civilian protection does become a more significant factor but there's disagreement between offices and sometimes between individuals about how that should play out and how that tension is resolved. This tension that we have between U.S. interests and U.S. values. It reminds me of what, with countries like Saudi Arabia, which has a poor record on human rights, and countries like the UAE, which has its own rights and expression problems. It reminds me of the approach that the Biden administration has tried to take on Russia from the beginning. This is before the Ukraine crisis. And if you'll recall, they said, we're going to cooperate in areas where we can, and we're going to compete in areas where we have to. That's something that they're doing with China, and it's something that they're doing with Russia. And I think that they would say with countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and UAE, which are important customers for US arms, but also have, this whole host of issues, they would say, we're going to call them out. We're going to, sometimes withhold things for stuff that we feel like might be blatantly used against their own population or civilians. But we're also going to continue to supply some arms sales because the relationships are important, because obviously they care about the defense industrial base and all of that. One of the other things that I think goes to what Lauren was talking about potential improvements is, there is a disagreement in the Biden administration about how all of this, the arms sales should play out. But I think there's widespread agreement that the process is kind of broken and that it takes too long, and that the bureaucracy in the State Department and in the executive branch and in the legislature and in Congress just doesn't have the bandwidth sometimes to keep up with the volume of sales that occur. And so I think that's something to consider when when we're discussing the potential for beefing up the regulatory requirements. Is that a lot of complaint I hear from the executive branch is that Congress is kind of overloaded on this stuff anyway. So I think that that's something to watch. And finally, the two final comments I'd like to make are that as this issue is going to be dealt with for the remainder of the Biden administration, there's two recent situations that I think could have interesting lasting effects. And one is Afghanistan, as Lauren mentioned, or this was obviously a huge security partner. We supplied Afghanistan with billions and billions of dollars up until July of last year. And I think that there will be lasting repercussions in terms of, how we think about burden sharing, especially in countries that are fragile democracies or where the security situation is more uncertain, how we think about that. Because there's a waste issue, but there's also the perceived threats that come along with a lot of the technology transfer that we've ended up doing to the Taliban. So I think that that's something to watch. The last issue I mentioned is I'm very interested in thinking about how the current war in Ukraine is going to impact how the Biden administration thinks about arms sales in the future. On one hand, you can see that many of the countries where we've been competing, or we're increasingly having to compete with, Russia and China, some of those countries, in countries where we're trying to sell arms and Russia and China are also potentially selling arms, some of those countries will no longer be buying weapons from Russia. I think it stands to reason because of sanctions or because of reputational problems, or they've taken a stand in the UN or whatever. So that's one issue. But then on the other hand, I think we could also think differently. We've tried to back away and have a firewall in some countries like Turkey between American arms programs and Russian arms programs. And how is the standoff and the isolation of Russia going to affect those countries where both we are one of many suppliers, including Russia. So I don't have answers to either of those questions, but I do think that those are interesting angles to watch in the coming months and years and could have a potentially lasting effect. So I'll just stop there. And thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Missy. Always fascinating to hear sort of what you're hearing in not only the halls of government, but as you're reporting from around the world. And I know you have to leave us early. So I wanted to start with just a question for you about how you're seeing how arms transfers are playing out. We've seen that in many cases, security cooperation, arms transfers are among the most prized touch points between recipient governments and their international vendors. You just mentioned sort of there's a firewall in Turkey, but there's a pride that comes with buying weapons from the United States, even when in the real world, there's a divergence on priorities and perspectives and alliances. There's still this notion that arms transfers foment bilateral relationships. We don't need to get into the research that shows that you can't, influence necessarily a state's behavior once you sell the arms. But I'm wondering if you can talk about just how you're seeing arms transfers shape perceptions of both the arms exporters, but also of that relationship in sort of the real world. You mentioned a couple of cases in your remarks that sort of triggered for me, we're seeing countries picking a side right now, right, because of what's happening in Ukraine. How is that going to, is that, sort of inauthentically creating partnerships that don't actually exist because all these other things don't work, but this arms transfer relationship is what's holding, is the glue holding that relationship together?
Yeah, I think it's a great observation, and I do think that the U.S. Like the panoply of things that we can provide to all these countries, going back to the some of the charts that Lauren and Peter were showing a few minutes ago, I think that the U.S. arsenal is still sort of the gold standard in terms of the countries that I speak with, and they're the coveted items. They come, as U.S. officials say, and I think it's true to a large extent. They come with this package of maintainers often, and it comes with which in itself sort of guarantees this ongoing relationship, which is at once, a sign of, being in the club of U.S. security, the security umbrella of the United States, even if it's not an explicit mutual defense guarantee. It also, I think the quality of the U.S. weapons is often higher. But on the flip side, there also are a lot of strings. Some of the strings are less desirable for a lot of these countries in terms of, as Lauren was talking about, the end use monitoring, even though some people think that it should be stronger. It is kind of onerous for a lot of countries. I went to Algeria recently with, I guess it was now in 2020, with Defense Secretary Esper at that time. And, I know that Algeria is one of the countries that's really bristled at, the end use monitoring. And that has been a big stumbling block to arms sales and there, that may be one of the more extreme examples, but the nosiness of everything that comes along with the oversight and the regulations of the U.S. programs are something that countries have varying levels of tolerance and sort of resistance to that. I think that if you look at the list of countries that are the biggest suppliers, most of them are clearly in the U.S. camp. There are some that, such as Saudi Arabia, that have increasingly explored, getting weapons from Russia. There are some like Turkey who have, kind of tried to have both, and with like a lot of problems that have come with that. But I do think that it does remain a significant glue and aspect of these bilateral relationships. Interoperability is, a big thing when it comes to Europe. And, now I know that there's, hopes that they can have greater interoperability in the Gulf, as, there's sort of these regional threats that people face. I'm not sure whether that will come to pass. But I do think that it will continue to be like one of the cornerstone things that the U.S. can offer to these other countries as a carrot and potentially, an incentive to get other sorts of behavior to happen. But as Rachel, as you noted, it often doesn't work. And there are certain things on the margins that I think can occur, but obviously countries have their national interests and they're going to make their decisions regardless of who's giving them their weapons.
Thanks, Missy. I know you do have to go, but we're happy to keep you as long as you're able to stay. But thank you for your insights and your tremendous continued reporting and focus and attention on this subject. I know it's greatly appreciated to sort of see those stories above the fold and remembering that, this is an important aspect to so much of what's happening in the world. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Peter, I want to turn to you because it's been a while since we heard from you today. And I think the points that you raised have really been about the trends that we're seeing have really been reflected in the comments from both Lauren and Missy. And I think because the world's attention is so focused right now on Ukraine, that that's where our discussion, in the recent past seems to focus. But you talked about many other areas where we're seeing continued high levels of arms transfers. And so I don't want to forget, and both Lauren and Missy mentioned Saudi Arabia and other countries that we know have been major recipients. But I think we all do recognize that we're seeing sort of a seismic shift at the moment of just the quantity in terms of both value, but also numbers of weapons that are flowing into Ukraine. And I know that CIPRI doesn't like to forecast what they think is coming, but I wonder if you could, we have a question about what do you see as the impact on the war on Ukraine to the global arms trade? Obviously, some of the largest buyers of Russian arms, India and China, remain close to Russia in this current environment. Egypt seems to have switched from the Su-35 to the F-15. Germany has announced its own buying spree. Are we sort of seeing a shift in both who the percentages of, that pie chart that you have of where the percentages are, but also is the volume, do you think, going to increase not just to Ukraine for the coming year, but sort of globally?
Very broad question there. Let's see how we can answer that in the best way. So some parts of the world, not necessarily an increase. I mentioned Latin America or South America there. I start with that again. Why? Because even there, though it has gotten to the lowest level of arms imports since a long time, Brazil has very, well, for that region, large arms procurement programs right now, which should lead to deliveries over the coming years. So even there, we can already start saying that, well, the likelihood is that even in that region of so much tranquility in terms of wars, conflicts, and also we would hope in terms of armament procurement, and actually we would hope action in the field of arms control. Even there, we see that a country decides to buy things like submarines, including a nuclear propelled one, which is really asking the question, why would you need that in that environment? So there we already start with a somewhat bleak future that we can sketch. In Europe, yes, obviously, Ukraine receives a significant amount of still relatively small, light weapons. So in terms of the actual volume, it's not going to be a very big player yet. No, it isn't, though those weapons will play an enormous important role in the actual ongoing war in the country. But of course, what we can expect is that throughout Europe, states will increase their military spending will continue to order new arms, and that over the coming decade or so, because it takes some time before arms procurement really kind of leads to actual deliveries, we can expect that several or most states in the region will increase their arms imports, and for that matter, for those who produce it themselves, also their overall arms procurement based on their own production. So I think we can really expect, and I think the market, the actual producers of arms have already shown that, and we have already seen that the stock market has reacted to that with higher prices for stocks in the arms industry. But of course, as you say, it may also have all kinds of effects elsewhere in the world. For example, as you mentioned, in those countries which are still very much buying Russian equipment. India, Egypt are very good examples. In Egypt, as you already said, it seems right now that Russia is losing the battle for the market. Why exactly is not entirely clear, because we haven't really been informed about what happened behind the scenes when it comes to that apparently far-going negotiations about the supply of F-15s from the US to Egypt, but something is happening there, and it's very significant, because F-15s for Egypt is a significant change in terms of military capability, in terms of the technology involved from what the US has been willing to supply to Egypt before, as far as I can see at this point in time already. So there we can expect a change. And this is maybe important, I already said the US has increased as a supplier of arms in the world. And this seems to add to that, the same as in Europe, which is primarily buying from Europe and from the United States. And then, of course, we can also have a look at, as you said, in India. Yes, it is dependent to a large extent on imports of arms from Russia. That has already declined. But now they end up in a situation where they will have to ask themselves, how are we going to pay? How are we going to transfer the money which we have to pay for the weapons we may buy from Russia? And do we want to continue to do that? Or are there maybe easier suppliers, which they already have turned to? France, Israel, or the European states. South Korea has joined the club and actually has sold arms to India already. And of course, also strengthening the relationship with the US by buying more arms. So yes, I think the developments in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, the sanctions on Russia will have a very clear effect on the global arms trade. Whether it will go up or not, I fear it will go up, specifically due to the increasing demand in Europe, and at the same time, the continuing high threat perceptions in Asia, primarily due to the tensions between China and other states and the US too, because we shouldn't forget that that is very much driving the increase in arms imports in several states in the region: Japan, South Korea, Australia, and also over the past few years, very major orders coming from Taiwan. So I think we can also see an increase in arms transfers there in the coming years.
Thanks, Pierre. I just want to follow up. There was another question about South Korea, about its emergence that you just mentioned in your comments to that question, but also in your presentation. Can you say a little bit more about South Korea's emergence, what it's selling, and to whom, and what we should expect from them in the years to come?
Yeah, South Korea has grown as an arms exporter significantly over the past decade. That is based on an arms industry which they have developed over time, primarily first to cater for their own demands, but then also looking abroad. They have succeeded in several different fields or categories of arms: combat aircraft, ships. Very recently, they have seen very significant deals for the supply of air defense systems. So it's really all over the board, which maybe differs from some of the other somewhat smaller arms suppliers in the world in the same league: Spain, Sweden, the Netherlands, which are more focused, are more niche. South Korea has really developed something where they even have managed to compete on markets where the national or the regional industry would be expected to win, in Europe in particular, where actually they have clinched a few relatively major deals in recent years, and more may come. So yes, South Korea is certainly a new player here. It has an advantage over, let's say, China in particular, as there are many more countries which are in principle willing to buy arms from South Korea, and particularly also the major arms markets in the world, whether that's India, Australia, which actually also has ordered South Korean equipment in recent years, Europe, even the US, they may be able to increase some arms sales there, or at least in strong cooperation then with the US arms industry. So definitely a country where you can expect higher exports also in the coming years. I say that carefully, of course, because you never know what happens, but there are very good reasons to assume that will be a more important player. If it will ever reach the level of, let's say, Germany or France, we have to see. I wouldn't think it's impossible.
Thanks, Peter. Lauren, there were a couple of technical questions for you before I get into some of the substantive things. So one of the question was about the threshold that you mentioned. It says, we heard that any arms sale below the $15 million threshold limit is not reported. Is the total one sale, like one sale at a time, or is it several sales together to the same country? So there was a clarification requested on that.
Got it. Well, there's a few different thresholds. I think it's one sale at a time, but then it's also, there are slightly different thresholds as well for NATO countries versus other countries. So it's case by case basis.
Thanks. Another technical question about the FMS figures that you referred to was whether those are for notifications, which, as we all know, many more things are notified than are actually delivered. So the question was, is that chart showing just the contracts? The Trump administration, as you know, like to tout every contract, every notification, but the actual deliveries, of course, were much lower, and deliveries can take place over a period of time, not just in the same calendar year from when that sale was first announced. So there was a clarification on that. And if there is a way, will delivery data be published or referenced in the future?
It's another really good, astute question. We do measure notifications because that is the clearest data we have available from the Defense Security Cooperation Agency that announces them. When we know that there are multiple competing notifications. For example, last year there was a case where there were 2 notifications that were, offered to a country and they had to choose just one. We pick the smaller one to stay conservative, in our numbers, so we're not overestimating. But that's right. So when the notifications are announced, this is usually before the contracts and sometimes before negotiations have finished, and so that is what we measure. There is much less data about deliveries. We haven't seen any significant changes to that, but would love to have more clear, public, meaningful information about deliveries.
Thanks, Lauren. And then the last sort of technical question is about whether or not there have been any formal FMS rules or regulatory changes in the last few years, either influenced by Congress or the administration. So things like tech transfer restrictions. Are there things that you're seeing that could impact sales in the future?
Have not for what we're tracking been following the tech transfers as closely. There may be something out there, but we haven't seen anything meaningful or significant that has gone through. We do from time to time see efforts within Congress to be more transparent and to clarify more data on sales. There were some initiatives as part of the last National Defense Authorization Act that ultimately did not go forward. And that's what we've been tracking more closely, but recently nothing meaningful that we've been tracking in terms of that.
Great, thank you. A question for both of you is whether or not you've seen any general trends about recipients diversifying their arms purchases, and in some cases even moving away from the US, for example, as an arms supplier. Is there any, and maybe Peter, this is particularly relevant for the charts that you just showed, but has there been any region or sub-region that's become less dependent on US arms transfers over the last decade? Or is assessing a client sort of diversification best done on a state-by-state basis, and so almost year by year, depending on what their needs are at the time?
I can Maybe start with that one. Looking at the figures that we have, again, the most important and clearest thing is the US is by far the largest supplier in the world. It supplies not only more in volume, but it also supplies to many more countries than, for example, Russia or even France does. I think we have about 100 countries for which we have identified exports of major arms in the past 5 years from the US to all those 100 states, or even more of them, compared to, I think, something like 40 or so for Russia. So already there we see a very clear difference. Where has the US lost terrain? Well, Turkey is, of course, a very clear example. At the same time, in the current crisis, who knows what may come out of that? I mean, Turkey is moving away from Russia again. I would really not be surprised if they're going to do something with those S-400, which will make the US happy, and therefore the normal relationship, or the kind of the long-term relationship between the two NATO partners can restart again. Egypt, we thought that the US was losing terrain there. Now we hear that they're going to sell F-15s. That's a big change. Egypt gives up on those Russian planes, which apparently they had ordered. If that is correct, that is a major breakthrough too. Saudi Arabia, yes, the Biden administration has a different view on things, but is there really reason to believe that it's going to be a big change? For now, at least, there are several major contracts which are in place, which the Biden administration has not stopped. We talk about F-15s, which are right now being built in Saudi Arabia itself, with the help, of course, of the original supplier, Boeing. That hasn't been stopped, not in the same way as the US administrations before, and also the Biden one continues to do that, stopping arms sales to Turkey because they just happen to buy one single S-400 system from Russia. So even there, we don't see a change. In Asia, there are indications that Indonesia is backing out of deals with Russia too, also because of the pressure that the US has put on them, and maybe also in relation to what Indonesia may believe is the best partner in relation to the potential threat that they may see from China in the future, already now. So I think overall, thinking of it, there are relatively few cases where I can see that the US is clearly playing a much less important role, or no role at all. I think that it's very few of them which come to mind. Even in Africa, there's always a lot of discussion, of course, about how China and Russia play an important role there, how they expand their influence, including using arms transfers. But even there, we see that even last year, the US did go ahead with the supply of light combat aircraft to Nigeria after many years of kind of doubt about that. They have gone ahead and therefore are a significant supplier of arms to Nigeria and also to a number of other states in the region, Kenya, Morocco, and even Algeria, which is very much a country which is has been buying weapons from Russia in large volumes, has now turned to the US for at least certain items, including transport aircraft. And then there is this mysterious deal, which no one knows if it actually has gone ahead, for very advanced signal intelligence aircraft too. So the picture is mixed, but my first kind of crude assessment would be, no, the US is not losing terrain. On the contrary, it's gaining terrain as an arms supplier to the world.
Thanks, Lauren. Do you have, yeah.
Sure. Just to add in, I think that very much matches with what we're seeing. Of course, we just measure the U.S. side of things and not other exporters. But of course, anecdotally, there was the Turkey case that Peter mentioned, where that caused a lot of consternation within U.S. government circles about Turkey buying selecting a missile defense system to buy from Russia. And so anecdotally, you'll see a lot of these cases. Certainly there was competition, for the United States from France with the Australia and Greece deals in particular, among others. But again, the US continues to be a big exporter.
Thanks, Peter. I had a technical question for you, which I'm not sure if you can answer, because it might be more on the military spending side. But what is the trend in sort of co-production and demand for co-production agreements as part of arms transfers?
Well, the demand is very clearly there. You can already see how in some cases certain countries have become much less dependent on arms imports, at least of complete systems. We mentioned South Korea before as a major arms exporting country, or an emerging one, a significant one by now. But that's of course also because they have become so much more self-sufficient. Yes, they still acquire some of the top end equipment such as F-35s from the US. For example, when it comes to submarines, they no longer have to buy the complete systems from Germany. They can now design and develop those themselves. And that is, of course, very much based on the long-term efforts that they've made to build up an arms industry based on foreign technology and expertise, which they have made their own over time. And I think this is throughout the world something which is happening. Some countries are very good at it. South Korea, others really are not. India has tried this for the past, well, basically 80 years or so, and has still not really completely succeeded in achieving all those major goals it has, and still it therefore remains very dependent on arms imports. At the same time, all these efforts they made also slow down their decisions, which again is one of the reasons that they have seen a decrease in arms imports over recent years. And I think also elsewhere, there are so many examples of countries which really try to build up their own arms industry. Middle East, we see that a country like the UAE and Saudi Arabia have put a lot of effort into trying to build up their own arms industry, which is extremely dependent on foreign technology, but also foreign staff. Both countries have built up their current arms industry with the help of experts coming from Europe, from Brazil, from South Africa, and maybe there I can finish with that particular case. There are states which have tried to build up their own arms industry in the past, also again based on technology imports. South Africa is one of them. But by now it doesn't have the demand for arms left to sustain such an arms industry, and as such there has been a brain drain where top-level missile experts, armored vehicle experts have actually left the country and moved to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So many different trends there, but the overall trend is that yes, most states will try to build to within arms import agreements, build in offsets that allow them to import technology and do some of the work or a significant amount of the work themselves.
Thanks. I think we could do a whole event on offsets and co-production agreements as well. There's a question in the Q&A, and I want to remind our audience, I see more are coming in now, to please use that in our final few minutes. I'll try and get to a few more questions. But there was one, you both mentioned sort of war in Ukraine. We've talked about sort of the increased expenditure that we're seeing from states as they purchase weapons, both in response to the war in Ukraine, preparing for whatever comes next. And the question is about Europe and what we are seeing in terms of the expectation for defense procurement in Europe. Do you think, and this is probably a question for Peter, but I think, Lauren, you may have some interesting insights as well. Do we think that defense procurement is going to be more US dependent, or is really the thought, the belief, the hope that Europe will collectively sort of build up their procurement using domestic or European suppliers?
I can maybe start with saying something there. First, of course, yes, there is a high pressure to build up military capability in Europe, has been there for some years, and now, of course, with the Ukraine war, it's only increasing very fast. However, the Ukraine war at the same time also shows something different, namely that Russia maybe wasn't that able militarily seen as many had expected. Many questions arise about what is it you actually need right now? How can you deal with this Russian threat for how long it ever may last? And what is it? Do we need more tanks? Well, maybe not, because the Russian tanks basically suck. Let's be honest. That's at least the initial conclusion that is made. So that whole process of assessing the actual outcome of that war and the actual capabilities of Russia as a military might will have to inform what then the decisions will be about what has to be procured. And will that be more advanced F-35 aircraft, or will it actually be more investment in things like cyber defense? Or actually, will there be states which are thinking more in terms of how are we going to build up our defense against infiltration, against what they call in Swedish psychological defense? Meaning, how do you make sure that your population truly understands how they're being targeted and how they are attempts to change their minds and their views on things? What can you do about that? Can you stick more in that? Can you stick more into how you want to do the same the other way around? You could say, how can you have a psychological offense towards civil society in Russia? There's so many questions there. And that leads again to the question of how will these demands be filled in? That is extremely unclear. Will it be primarily imports from the US? Yes, there will be a very substantial amount of that, because the US has things on offer which Europe doesn't have right now. The F-35 is simply superior, it seems, based on decisions made by several European states, many European states, including Switzerland and Finland last year. That is the plane to have. But when it comes to naval equipment, that is not the case. Nobody's going to buy really anything US there, because the US doesn't have submarines or frigates on offer. And the same for armored vehicles, it will be more mixed. Poland has chosen for US tanks. Hungary has chosen for German tanks, and I think that mix will continue. Then finally, yes, there will be continuing attempts, as in the past, within Europe to develop and co-produce items themselves. This is always very difficult to do. Those programs take a lot of time, a lot of negotiation about how they will look like. So several of them will probably fail. Others will be more successful. But the mix, as it has been, I would expect it to remain the same.
Thanks, Lauren. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Sure. I would just, I would say that really makes sense from a European side, and just to kind of answer from the American side about how, what changes we might see as a result of what's happening in Ukraine. You know, the Defense Department has put in place, you know, a team to expedite sales, to expedite not only US exports, but also third-party transfers. So, you know, weapons from the Baltics, for example, to get to Ukraine. So in terms of, you know, long-term changes that we're seeing, there is this capability. You know, I think our hope is that these kinds of changes are considered on a case-by-case basis, right? What's appropriate for Ukraine is not appropriate for a country with a poor human rights record. And, you know, just because we can do instantaneous transfers doesn't mean we always should. You know, despite some feelings from within, you know, certain ambassadors and others that things move too slowly, it really is case-by-case. But certainly from the US side, I think this invasion has demonstrated that the US, including Congress, can respond very quickly when it wants to.
I just want to follow up quickly because I see we're running out of time. But Lauren, I want to give you an opportunity to just talk about transparency and availability of data. There's a question about the Congressional Research Service used to publish an annual report on the global arms trade, which had lots of great tables. It was titled Arms Transfers to Developing Nations, but it had much more than that included. But it has been, it has stopped or slowed. It's very hard to get. Do you know anything that you can share about that? But can you talk a little bit about transparency challenges? I mean, it really applies to both of you. You're trying to get this information. Talk about what those challenges might look like.
Sure, I'll start with the CRS side. I love CRS reports. They're so wonderful. And I also am very sad when they stop being produced. we don't know the reasons always, but of course, CRS works for the US Congress. And when a report is forthcoming and then stops, in my mind, that's an indication that members of Congress at large are not asking for those reports. If they were in large numbers, they would be consistently publicly available. And so that, cements in my mind that the public and NGO communities need to be even more involved in this because, we're not seeing the calls from Congress as even sometimes in years past we have. And so I would love to see more data coming out, but what we've seen from CRS has consistently been incredibly helpful. In terms of where else we get information, I mentioned before, it's from Defense Department, State Department budget documents, sometimes from the GAO, sometimes special country reports. In Afghanistan, the SIGAR or Special Inspector General reports were incredibly helpful, but it's kind of a hodgepodge of reports, and in my ideal world, we would have very clear data all the time, security assistance and arms sales listed out by country and, an Excel spreadsheet that we could use and upload. And then we'd have much less work to do, but it's not the case, unfortunately. And so what we do now is we take all the publicly available information from US government documents that we always cite and piece them together as best we can. And sometimes the data looks very different from year to year for no discernible reason, except that, someone has changed a PDF sheet in the way that budget documents are reported. And so, that is one of the challenges, but, we think that it's important to keep these in a consistent format. And that's why we also maintain our databases.
Thanks. Peter, I don't know if you want to add something about transparency in the last minute here.
Yeah, transparency is very kind of core to what CIPRI does. Yes, we provide the information, but in a way we would hope that we would be out of job because every state would provide this information in detail and in a constructive manner. And this is not always the case. What happens now in Ukraine and how that will impact on how Russia will behave will, for example, mean very likely that they're going to be even less transparent than they already were about their arms exports. But also in the US, we have seen a few developments which I'd like to mention here, just to kind of end from my side, I think. For example, the fact that right now we have somewhere in Geneva, the group of governmental experts on the United Nations Register of Conventional Arms. That's a long term, but what it comes down to is that the US and every other state in the world has agreed to supply information about their arms deliveries, their arms exports, and for that matter also their arms imports and their holdings to a specific UN register. Now, under the Trump administration, that disappeared. There was no report for 2019 again. Now, luckily, the Biden administration seems to have to kind of started this up again, or at least someone within the Biden administration or within the State Department has dared to do this again, which is good. Now, at least there is a report. What is bad about it? That it's not complete. The latest report, which I just saw a few days ago, that's why I mention it here, does not even mention any exports of F-35s in 2020. So there is still a lot of work to be done to improve that report. And that is the case for the US, let alone for so many other states, which we would hope would be so much more open about what they do. And that is the challenge for CIPRI then, to provide an alternative, which of course will never be completely accurate, but for now is the best that I think you can have.
Well, I personally am very grateful to both of you for continuing to publish this data, to provide it to us in a usable and really significant format that gives us these important glimpses and allows us to have these conversations that are based on the best data that is available. I want to really thank CIPRI for co-hosting this with us again this year. It's really a pleasure. And I think the pandemic did not bring a lot of good things to our lives, but I think the realization that we can host this event virtually year after year and have a great audience participation is really a testament to the great work that you all do, but also to the interest in discussing that work. We had many questions that I just didn't have time to get to, which also signals to me that there's great interest in having these discussions and ensuring that people are aware of what arms transfers are happening around the world. So thanks to Peter and Lauren, and of course, Missy, for sharing your perspectives and your analysis with us. I think the takeaway for me is as we look at arms transfers that are occurring in the last year, the last 5 years, and looking forward what we're seeing today, there is a real necessity to be strategic about those arms transfers. And that strategy does not just apply to the immediate short-term gains, but also the long-term implications and the impact on international peace and security and on civilians. I personally, as you all know, I think it was last year, even and the year before for sure, I criticized the Trump administration for being very short-sighted in their transactional approach to arms transfers. And I hope that we've learned some lessons from that period of time as we deal with the crisis in Ukraine, as we look at conflicts that are emerging around the world and continue to rage, and in some ways are raging sort of behind the scenes right now as world attention is focused on other areas of the world, and to just recognize that arms transfers live long beyond and their impact long beyond the actual transfer themselves. So thank you for reminding us of that today, and for all the great work that you all do. Thank you to our audience for participating. A video of this event will be available on the Stimson website, and we look forward to welcoming you back to this platform in the near future to discuss these issues again. Thanks so much. Have